Today, the United Kingdom is among the world's most celebrated monarchies. It is also one of the longest running. The roots of the British monarchy lie deep in the early Middle Ages. Who was the first King of England? Interestingly, the harrowing Viking invasions of the 9th century led to the birth of a united English kingdom. Today, on Real Crusades History, we'll delve into England's distant past and discover the first King of England to emerge from the near-apocalyptic clash between Anglo-Saxons and Vikings. At the start of the 9th century, there was no indication that the region today known as England would ever be united into a single kingdom. Instead, there existed several small Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, each ruled by its own chieftain. However, as the Viking Age began, Scandinavian ships, mostly from modern Denmark, began to show up along the English coast, inflicting devastating raids on the local populations. By the middle of the century, these raids had turned to full-scale invasions. In 865, a united Viking army, the Great Heathen Army, attacked the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Within 10 years, nearly all of the old Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had fallen. Northumbria in 867, East Anglia in 869, and most of Mercia between 874 and 877. All of these territories, known as the Danelaw, regions under the law of the Danes, would be ruled by the Vikings. Only the Kingdom of Wessex, ruled by Alfred the Great, survived. However, the Vikings also threatened Wessex, and it seemed that Wessex too would soon fall to the Danish invaders. Alfred the Great and his dynasty stood as the final defenders of Anglo-Saxon England. In 878, Alfred the Great and a small army of Anglo-Saxons finally turned things around. From their fortress of Athelflaed, hidden deep in the marshes of Somerset, they struck out and defeated the Vikings at the Battle of Edington. The Viking chieftain Guthrum surrendered and withdrew from Wessex. The Vikings still ruled Northumbria, East Anglia, and eastern Mercia, but Wessex under King Alfred was saved, and western Mercia was secured under Anglo-Saxon control. Alfred the Great launched a series of reforms, laying the foundation for a revival of Anglo-Saxon rule in England. Alfred was fortunate to have two very capable children, his eldest son Edward and his eldest daughter Aethelflaed. In the early 880s, Aethelflaed married Aethelred, Lord of the Mercians, ruler of western Mercia, strengthening the alliance between the last two Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. In 895, when Alfred was an elderly king, his son Edward welcomed the birth of a baby boy, Athelstan. King Alfred presented his little grandson with the regalia of kingship, a Saxon sword and belt, and a royal cloak. When Alfred the Great died in 899, his son, Edward the Elder, succeeded him as King of Wessex. As Lady of the Mercians, Aethelflaed cooperated closely with her brother, Edward. Aethelflaed appears to have cherished her nephew, Athelstan, treating him like her own son. When Athelstan was a small boy, he went to live in Mercia, in the household of his aunt, Aethelflaed. Here, Athelstan was educated at the monastery school of Worcester. Athelstan was literate from childhood, reared on the same Anglo-Saxon poetry that had inspired his grandfather. Though he was born in Wessex, Athelstan's childhood in the household of his aunt strengthened his ties with the Mercians. Scholars aren't sure, but it seems possible that King Edward and the Lady Aethelflaed planned for Athelstan to assume rule in Mercia as well as Wessex, thus fulfilling their father's goal of uniting the two kingdoms. There's also speculation that Edward never intended for Athelstan to be King of Wessex at all, but that he intended for him to simply be Lord of Mercia, while another son, Aethelflaed, would be king of Wessex. Edward the Elder died on July 17, 924. It appears that Aethelflaed then became king of Wessex for 16 weeks before he himself died of unknown causes. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle fails to mention Aethelflaed's reign, while some later sources describe him as reigning briefly. Whatever the case, shortly after his father's death, Athelstan was ruler of both Mercia and Wessex. He may have encountered some resistance in Wessex from some of the high-ranking men in the kingdom. Again, scholars aren't certain. One of his brothers, the Atheling Edwin, appears to have tried to assassinate him in Winchester. But by 925, Athelstan became king of Wessex. He was crowned in September at Kingston-upon-Thames, the symbolic border between Mercia and Wessex. Athelstan was now around 30 years old, already a seasoned politician who had benefited from the wisdom of both his father and his aunt. In the early Middle Ages, no king ever succeeded just as a matter of course. Even if he had the endorsement of his father, rebellious factions often attempted to thwart his succession. Athelstan's coronation in 925 was as much a statement of the results of a power struggle as it was a smooth state-managed changeover. Clearly, Athelstan had won the political victory, and the other royal brothers would remain Athelings. Athelstan and his advisors followed the 9th century Frankish tradition. Athelstan was anointed not only as ruler, but as the special servant of God, like a bishop. The Carolingian Franks viewed anointing as crucial to kingship, and the Anglo-Saxons adopted this tradition fully. Thus, the church played an indispensable role in solidifying the power of the king, initiating him into the divine order as God's agent on earth. At his coronation, Athelstan was named King of the Anglo-Saxons. In addition to being anointed with oil by the clergy, he received the royal ring, the sword, crown, and scepter of kingship. Before the gathered nobles and clergymen, he made a threefold vow: to keep his people in peace, to forbid robbery and wrongdoing by all men, no matter their rank, and to promote justice and mercy through maintenance of the law. These were not mere platitudes, but addressed the most pressing concerns faced by 10th century Anglo-Saxon society. Those with power and energy must not simply be permitted to prey upon the weak and vulnerable. It was the king's role to ensure rule by law, not by brute strength. In this age, as in perhaps all ages, the descent into lawless chaos lay just below the surface. As a symbol of his role, and indeed of his humility, the king then freed a slave and his family. This was an ancient tradition performed by many early medieval kings. Although Athelstan faced opposition from some of his siblings, historian Christopher Brooke still concludes that he was as readily accepted as king in Mercia as in Wessex. The local particularities between these two kingdoms were dissolving. Athelstan sought to continue his family's work of subduing the Vikings. In 927, he began a series of energetic military operations which would spread West Saxon military power over the whole of Britain. At the time, York, in Northumbria, was ruled by the Viking clan Ivar, which also controlled the Irish city of Dublin. In 927, Athelstan invaded Northumbria, demolished the Viking forts, and seized control of York from the chieftain Olaf of the clan Ivar. It was a spectacular triumph. From the booty taken, Athelstan enriched his army. For the first time, a king from the House of Wessex controlled York. As a result, Constantine II, King of Scotland, and Owen, the Welsh King of Strathclyde, both submitted to Athelstan's overlordship. In 928, Athelstan subdued the 5 kings who ruled Wales. Coins from the time produced by Athelstan bear the inscription Rex Totius Britannia, King of all Britain. In Easter of 928, Athelstan sat in glory on his throne at Exeter. He had made a clean sweep of his enemies and achieved the subjugation of the whole island. He was, as David Wood writes, the most powerful man to rule in Britain since the Romans. Athelstan's fame spread throughout Christendom, and ambassadors arrived from foreign kingdoms, bringing gifts and requesting marriage alliances with his sisters. Otto the Great of Germany exchanged books with Athelstan, and ultimately Otto himself married a West Saxon princess, Edith of England. Having acquired a far larger kingdom than any previous ruler, Athelstan sought to reduce criminality and abuses by local magnates. Athelstan's law codes are an important advance on the Mosaic, Old Testament, eye for an eye legislation that existed prior to his reign. His work is an example of the advance beyond tribal thinking to the need to enact justice on a wider scale. Athelstan's greatest challenge came in 937. That year, his old enemies sought to overthrow his power at last. Constantine II, King of Scotland, formed an alliance with the Viking Olaf of the clan Ivar and Owen, King of the Welsh-speaking kingdom of Strathclyde in southwest Scotland. Olaf, at the head of an army of Vikings from both Ireland and Northumbria, raided Mercia, leaving terrible destruction in his wake. In 937, Athelstan and his brother Edmund responded. They assembled a considerable army and marched north. The Anglo-Saxons met Olaf and Constantine's Viking, Scottish, Welsh coalition army at Brunanburh. Here took place one of the most memorable battles in the history of the British Isles. Standing opposite one another, the two armies advanced in shield wall formation, arrayed in the infantry fighting style typical of the period. The brutal hand-to-hand fighting lasted all day. The Anglo-Saxons endured serious casualties, but ultimately, Olaf's northern coalition was destroyed. Olaf fled to the Viking-held city of Dublin in Ireland, while Constantine returned to Scotland, where he eventually abdicated in 943, ending his days as a monk at the monastery of St. Andrews. The sources of the time provide no clear details as to the action of the battle. However, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle does offer a stirring account. In this year King Athelstan, Lord of Nobles, dispenser of treasure to men, and his brother also, Edmund Atheling, won by the sword's edge undying glory in battle round Brunanburh. Edward's sons clove the shield wall, hewed the lindenwood shields with hammered swords. Their enemies perished. The people of the Scots and the Northmen fell doomed. The field grew dark with the blood of men from the time when the sun, that glorious luminary, the bright candle of God, of the Lord Eternal, moved over the earth in the hours of the morning, until that noble creation sank at its setting. There lay many a man destroyed by the spears, many a northern warrior shot over his shield, and likewise many a Scot lay weary, sated with battle. The Battle of Brunanburh was the landmark event of Athelstan's reign. This victory meant that England would remain united under Athelstan. Because of this, Athelstan has often been considered the first proper king of the English. Hundreds of years later, the 12th century chronicler William of Malmesbury would write that no one more just or more learned ever governed the kingdom than Athelstan. Historians still debate the significance of Athelstan's reign. David Dumville calls Athelstan the father of medieval and modern England. Michael Wood describes Athelstan as one of the more important lay intellectuals in Anglo-Saxon history. Other historians insist that Athelstan was more critical in developing the idea of the Kingdom of England rather than the reality of it. George Molyneux writes, "The tendency of some modern historians to celebrate Athelstan as the first king of England is problematic, since there is little sign that in his day the title Rex Anglorum was closely or consistently tied to an area similar to that which we consider England. When Athelstan's rule was associated with any definite geographical expanse, the territory in question was usually the whole island of Britain. While the question remains open to debate, it's certainly true that Aethelstan held more territory than any ruler of Britain since the Romans, and the kingdom he established clearly lies at the heart of the medieval kingdom of England. When he died in 939, Aethelstan was recognized as one of the leading kings of Christian Europe. Today, some even describe Aethelstan as the English Charlemagne. Thanks for watching. Now, learn about Aethelstan's grandfather, Alfred the Great, and his battles with Vikings in 9th century Britain. Click on the video linked on your screen to watch our full-length documentary on the saga of Alfred the Great's reign.